Early in March of 1915, the weather turned warmer and both sides became more active. The British had set their sights on Hill 60, a small elevation from which their opponents could observe and bomb them. Once the soil had warmed sufficiently, they started digging a tunnel towards the German positions. Then they quietly filled several chambers with explosives, and on the evening of April 17th, they detonated them, sending Hill 60 and its garrison sky high. The Germans had been secretly digging as well, though they had even more lethal plans.
Es war ein schöner Tag. Die Sonne schien. Wir hätten ein Picknick machen sollen, anstatt das zu tun, was wir taten. Unsere Artillerie begann am Nachmittag ein großes Bombardement, um die Franzosen in ihren Schützengräben zu halten. Nachdem das Kanonenfeuer aufhörte, schickten wir die Infanterie zurück und öffneten die Hähne. Wir fragten uns, was geschehen würde.
It was Thursday evening, April 22nd. We had just fought our first big action in the fight for Hill 60. Now, some of us were stretched out asleep on the grass. As the sun was beginning to sink, this peaceful atmosphere was shattered by the noise of heavy shell fire. But more curious than anything was a low cloud of yellow-grey smoke.
Auf einmal hörten wir die Franzosen schreien. Sie schossen mit Maschinengewehren darauf los, wie ich es zuvor noch nie gehört hatte. Eine unermessliche Anzahl von Kugeln flog über unsere Köpfe hinweg, doch das Gas konnten sie nicht aufhalten. Nach 15 Minuten verstummten die Schüsse allmählich. Dann wurde alles still.
It was on the afternoon of my birthday that we noticed volumes of dense yellow smoke coming towards the British trenches. We did not get the full effect of it, but what we did was enough for me. The next thing I noticed was a horde of French colonials making for the trenches behind the firing line. The poor devils were absolutely paralyzed with fear.
Nach einiger Zeit klärte sich die Luft und wir liefen an den leeren Gasflaschen entlang. Alles war tot. Nichts lebte mehr. Überall lagen tote Ratten, Kaninchen und Mäuse. Die französischen Schützengräben waren leer. Aber auf den folgenden 100 Metern lagen überall die Leichen erstickter Franzosen. An ihren zerkratzten Gesichtern und Hälsen sahen wir, dass sie verzweifelt versucht hatten, Luft zu bekommen. Manche hatten sich selbst erschossen. Auf den Bauernhöfen lagen die Pferde tot in ihren Ställen. Kühe, Hühner, alles und jeder war tot. Alles.
By evening, it had become clear the Germans had released poisonous chlorine gas north of Ypres. The French troops holding that part of the line were all but wiped out. Unless the resulting breach could be plugged, the road to Ypres lay wide open.
Our battalion and the 16th Canadian Scottish were the only reserves in the whole salient. We were instantly summoned to fall in, and soon we were on our way to fill the gap. 2,000 men to stop the German divisions in their thousands.
At midnight, without bombs, machine guns, or artillery support, we started to advance. Enemy machine guns opened about as hot a fire as you could imagine. Men fell in hundreds, but some of us got there. And when they were facing our bayonets, the Germans were beaten, and those that weren't killed escaped as fast as they could.
An hour after we had dug in, there was a terrible concentration of shells sweeping Kitchener's Wood. It was impossible for us to hold the position, but instead of retiring, we tried our old tactics of advancing and attacking again.
Though the toll in casualties was high, a German breakthrough had been averted. But the cards remained heavily stacked against the outnumbered Allies. At this point, bluffing was all they could do.
April 23rd. had to go into ditches and fire a few rounds, and go a bit further and fire a few more, and come back and fire again. And this was to give the impression to the Germans there were plenty of troops there. And that went on for 4 days, back and forwards, out and in, here and there. We never knew where we were or what we were supposed to be doing.
The Germans renewed the attack the next morning.
That day was the worst day of my life. It started with a really violent bombardment, and then you could only call it a cloud of death when the gas came over. People were suffocating, but the word was passed down that we were to hold on at all costs.
We went on, and as we went up, the Canadians and the Highlanders were retreating because they had been under gas. All they had on was the bandage out of the first aid kit, and they had those bandages on their eyes, and there they went, staggering back. We never reached the front line. The gas was too dense, and then we had to retire.
To try to stop the German advance, more troops were thrown into the battle a day later.
April 25th. The idea had got about that the German trenches were 200 yards away. When our front line went over the top, they found that there was anything from 12 to 1,500 yards to go, and the 2 British and 4 Indian regiments who led the way were absolutely mowed down. The slaughter was cruel. It was men against every machine that frightfulness could devise.
It would be men against machine for many days to come. And that was a confrontation the Allied troops could never win. Their situation became as hopeless as it was 6 months earlier. But just like then, it was the Germans who gave up first. After a month of ferocious fighting, they withdrew and dug in a few miles closer to Ypres, satisfied they had tightened the noose around the city. Tens of thousands of young men had lost their lives in the process. And yet, it didn't take long for the madness to resume.
July 30th. I remember having a strong presentiment that night that I would never come back alive. The silence after we got into the line became uncanny. About half an hour before dawn, there was a sudden hissing sound. I saw 3 or 4 distinct jets of flame, like a line of powerful fire hoses spraying fire instead of water. It was a death trap to stay where we were, and our company commander gave the order to get the remnant of my platoon. About a dozen men were all that I could find. Those who had faced the flame attack were never seen again.
Both sides had become very efficient at exterminating one another like vermin, with underground mines and poisonous gas, and now also with flamethrowers. It gave Ypres and the Salient a reputation it would never lose during the war.
It is known to us as worse than hell. It was once one of the prettiest towns in Belgium, but now it is only a heap of ruins with dead civilians and soldiers everywhere. Our soldiers dread to hear that they have to go to that place. Anywhere except there is the cry.
It is said that time heals all wounds, and usually it does, but not always. This is Hoche. Time has healed part of the battlefield, filling in a massive crater to create a lovely scene. But time cannot hide everything. Just beyond are the trenches whose occupants were incinerated that awful July night. And all over the area, the remnants of year after year of fighting. Hoche was one of these ferociously contested hotspots, where both sides sent countless young to die. Nearby, time has healed more generously. Here, it is mostly monuments that pinpoint the horrors which took place. Less than a mile from Hohe is the memorial to the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. Its soldiers held this ridge during 10 days of desperate fighting, and so, we are reminded, counted not the cost. Which is a nicer way of saying the battalion was wiped out. It seems so long ago, and trivial even, but the hundreds of men who were killed holding the line in no small part caused their opponents to abandon their efforts and bring that month of bitter fighting to an end. Behind that line lays territory the Germans occupied after their first gas attack. Several villages north of Ypres were quickly overrun and would remain in German hands for the next 2 years. So did the small village of Saint-Julien, though the British sent in thousands of men to retake it. Many of them never made it back. A small sign tells of the suicidal attack on Kitchener's Wood, the first of many desperate counterattacks. Nearer to where the wood once stood is a nicer marker, though still hardly sufficient to commemorate the heroics of the first Canadians to fight on foreign soil. Then again, there were so many heroics on display that spring. It is simply impossible to acknowledge all. Not far from Saint-Julien is the monument that commemorates all Canadians who withstood the first gas attack. Known as the Brooding Soldier, it pays tribute to the men who helped breach the gap. 2,000 of them didn't survive the first few days. Thousands more would be killed the following weeks. At the other end of that gap are memorials to the Belgian and French soldiers that did their part in plugging the line. The Belgian grenadiers fought courageously, yielding them one of the many small and lonely obelisks that dot Flanders fields. A bit further is the Cross of Sacrifice, commemorating the French victims of the gas attack. A somewhat unimaginative memorial, but the original was destroyed by the Germans during the Second World War because they objected to their gas attack being described as barbaric. As if what happened here that beautiful day could be called anything else. For here, the world witnessed the birth of chemical warfare. If anyone still had any illusions about fighting for liberty and justice, they dissipated over these fields 100 years ago. The Salient would witness much more misery in the days and weeks ahead, with the war demanding its daily offering of dead and wounded. But the mass slaughter that had unfolded here in the months before shifted further south. Ypres, the Germans had concluded, was not the place to try to break through the line. Instead, they focused on their line of defense. Not just the front line, but a second line behind the first, and later a third, and even a fourth. The Salient had become a fortress, and every week that fortress was becoming more impregnable. Britain's military leadership on the other hand, considered the salient the perfect place to break through the line. It realized, however, it would never succeed in doing so until their opponents had been driven from their higher positions south of Ypres. So it decided to blow them out of those. Specially commissioned tunneling companies began digging towards the German lines. After more than a year of back-breaking work, 24 tunnels had been completed and filled with explosives. All was ready for the big show, as it had become known. Though it was supposed to be a secret, the big show was planned for June 7th as Achiel von Wallachem, pastor at the nearby village of Dikkebus, noted in his diary.
Het was juist 4 uur en het eerste daglicht begon te schemeren toen ik al meteen het reusachtigste en tevens het ijselijke prachtigste vuurwerk zag dat ooit in Vlaanderen ontstoken werd. Een ware vulkaan. Het was of Hans het Zuidoosten vuur spuwde. Oh, waar het geen mensenslachterij, maar zo'n prachtig noem.
Carnage it was indeed. Thousands of Germans were blown up. Many more surrendered, completely dazed and demoralized, and those who resisted were finished off by the advancing infantry. This day had clearly been won by the Allies. The high ground surrounding Ypres was firmly in British hands. Now preparations could begin for the second act. Preparations on such a scale, they clearly pointed to a major offensive.
Maandag 9 juli. Meer en meer wordt er gesproken van de aanstaande offensief. We zijn de menigvuldige en de grootste toebereidselen hier. Kanons worden toegebracht en de munitiedepots vermenigvuldigen en vermeerderen gedurig. Iedereen is ermee bezig. Soldaten en officieren voorspellen aan de burgers dat het schrikkelijk zal zijn. Ze moeten er kost wat kost deuren. En binnen korte weken zijn de Vlaanders verlost.
The British bombardment started 1 week later. Thousands of guns began pounding the German lines. For the soldiers on the receiving end, it was a nightmare.
Unaufhörlich sausten neue Salven heran. Es war fast nicht auszuhalten. Die Erde dampfte, zischte, kochte. Sie schien sich zu bewegen und zu brennen. Über und über wurden wir mit Schlamm beworfen. Manche wurden zum Teil mit rauchender Erde fast zugedeckt und begraben. Nase und Mund öffneten sich weit. Die Zähne bissen sich zusammen, um die andauernden Explosionen ertragen zu können. Man bekam mitunter das Gefühl, als ob einem das Blut aus den Poren stürzen und die Nerven zerreißen wollten.
After the guns had been firing without interruption for 2 weeks, more than 100,000 men were ordered over the top.
July 31st. It was a terrible sight, really awe-inspiring, to see the barrage playing on the German front lines before we went over. Just a solid line of fire and sparks and rockets lighting up the sky. When the barrage began to lift, we went over like one man towards the German front line. There was not a bit of wire that hadn't been blown to smithereens by our barrage.
It seemed as if everything was going according to plan, with one of the ridges north of Ypres quickly taken.
31 juli. Veel overdrevenheden worden er verteld. Men spreekt van 5 mijl vooruitgang. Wij hoorden dat peren opgetrokken zijn om de kanon verder te voeren. En om 9 uur zijn we de Engelse cavalerie afkomen van West-Oeter en optrekken naar het front. Ze passeren hier 2 uur lang en ik bewonder hun schone peren en een taldrik hoedalaan.
But it didn't take long for the first disturbing reports to filter back. The bombardments had destroyed the first German line, but most of its occupants had withdrawn to their strongly fortified second line. There they waited for their opponents, who had a terrible time trying to get across the terrain. they made for easy targets.
Geschützt durch sein Sperrfeuer war der Feind in der Lage, sich bis auf beinahe 40 Meter an unseren Zaun anzunähern. Dann schlugen die Wachposten Alarm. Wir wussten sofort, was vor sich ging. Wir verließen schnell unsere Unterkünfte und begannen zu schießen und Handgranaten zu werfen. Die Engländer fielen zu Hunderten.
To make things even worse, it then began to rain.
At 6 p.m., it began to rain and continued incessantly for 30 hours. In a proper line of trenches, it would have been quite beastly, but in an absolutely new line with practically no means of revetting it, it beggars description.
We had blokes badly wounded. We had laid them on duck boards because we had no stretchers. Then there was a lull in the shelling, and through the machine gun slit in the back wall of the pillbox, we heard this terrible kind of gargling noise. It was the wounded, lying there sinking, and this liquid mud burying them alive. We couldn't understand why. In the name of God, anyone had ordered an attack like that over a terrain like that.
The first day of the Great Flanders Offensive had turned into a disaster. But those making the decisions refused to accept what every soldier in the line knew only too well. They ordered more guns to pummel German positions, making the terrain their troops would have to take and hold even more of a quagmire. And then they sent them back into it.
August 16th. We had a tremendous barrage down that morning. All you could see in front of the German line were red and yellow flashes of shells bursting. But there was no chance of the infantry getting across. I watched them gradually trying to work their way forward, struggling like blazes through this frightful bog to get at the Germans. They were up to their knees in mud, and by the time they got halfway across, it was virtually impossible for them to move either forward or back. When we lifted the barrage, the machine guns started to pick them off. They just went down into the mud. It was a sickening sight. It made me feel ill to watch it.
That action caused another 15,000 casualties, and still the lesson was not learned. More men were ordered onto the slopes a week later and left to die a terrible death.
August 27th. From the darkness on all sides came the groans and wails of wounded men. Faint, long, sobbing moans of agony and despairing shrieks. It was too horribly obvious that dozens of men with serious wounds must have crawled for safety into new shell holes, and now water was rising about them, and, powerless to move, they were slowly drowning. And we could do nothing to help them.
After the wettest August in living memory came a warm and dry September. It allowed for much-needed repairs to be made.
It was certainly no joke working on these roads. Jerry had them taped off to an inch and was shelling them unmercifully. A shell has landed in the road and knocked a hole in it, and as likely as not put out of action a lorry or a man or two. A squad of men is quickly on the spot, and the hole is filled up with any mortal thing that can be found, and in a few minutes the traffic moves on once more, and the war goes on.
I was a driver in the artillery, and it was our job to get the ammunition up. We could only take limbers so far because of the shell holes, so we had to go up the rest of the way with a walking squad leading the horses. We used to go 20 of us together, leaving the wagon lines at about 3 o'clock, and we reached the guns about 7 o'clock at night, if we were lucky enough to reach the guns. We sometimes thought it was a complete waste of time. The gunners never saw half the shells. With the weight of them, they were just sinking into the mud, and it was a complete waste of ammunition because they couldn't find them.
Even so, enough shells reached the guns to start a massive bombardment. With the weather finally cooperating, it paid off. On September 20th, 65,000 men went over the top. In some places, a mile of German territory was taken. A week later, Australian troops drove the Germans out of Polygon Wood, and by October 4th, they had recaptured what little was left of the village of Zonnebeke.
From the ridge, the whole field was under observation, and as we gazed back over the country, we could see quite plainly the movements of our own units. The ridge was a prize worth having. Hundreds of German prisoners were now struggling back through our lines. By now, we felt really quite sorry for them. They were in such abject misery. You could see by the strain on their faces that they'd had a bad time under our shell fire. A lot of them were wounded, and those who could were hobbling along as fast as they could to get away from the lines.
By now, the battle had been raging for more than 2 months. More than 100,000 Allied soldiers had been killed, wounded, or reported missing to reach a line that should have been taken during the first week of the offensive. Rain and mud had seen to that. They simply made any progress impossible. Anyone could see that, except for the decision makers in their planning rooms, far behind the reality of the lines. So when it started raining again, they ordered the troops to attack, even though there was no way the artillery could be brought in position in time.
October 9th. As dawn approached, I could see the faint outline of a ridge about 400 or 500 yards in front. I was knee-deep in slush, and then I heard the sound of a heavy gun firing. Heavy German shells were already falling amongst us, and shrapnel was flying all over the place. There were shouts and screams of men falling all around. The attack never got off the ground.
By evening, the attackers were back at their starting lines, minus the thousands of men who were left behind. 3 days later, they were ordered to attack again, this time to take what was left of the village of Passchendaele. Once more, it was clear there wouldn't be sufficient artillery support. Once more, it didn't take great foresight to predict the outcome.
October 11th. It was an appalling sight. The wind and the rain lashing down. The horses screaming and rearing and plunging down into the mud as the shells exploded all around us. It seemed as if every gun was trained on this small area. Eventually, when the shelling began to tail off, we went back and hooked the team up to the gun. We only managed to get 4 guns forward, and most of our other batteries were in the same state or worse, which didn't make the prospects for the morning look too good.
That proved to be an understatement. The New Zealand infantry was massacred, causing the country its largest single-day loss of life ever.
Recovering the New Zealand wounded from the battlefield took 2.5 days, even with 3,000 extra men. The conditions were horrendous, and up to 8 men were needed to carry each stretcher because of the mud and water. The Germans suffered the same problems, and an informal truce for stretcher bearers came into force. By the evening of October 14th, there simply was no one left alive on the battlefield.
The first attempt to take Passchendaele had failed completely. the job would have to be finished by Canadian troops. They hardly believed their eyes when they returned.
We had been behind St. Julian in the gas attack in 1915. Now, I wouldn't have recognized the place. The whole area was utterly devastated. There was no trace of the farms that were there in 1915. Nothing but this ocean of mud and dumps and a few battered pillboxes.
This ocean of mud now had to be crossed. Machine gunner Reginald Lebrun saw the men heading into it.
The infantry attacked early in the morning of October 26th. We had been ordered to fire 500 rounds every 20 minutes throughout the previous night. At dawn, the infantry went on past us, and we elevated our sights to cover them.
Facing the Canadians were fortified machine gun posts. The troops suffered heavy casualties, but neutralized them one by one. 3 days later, in pouring rain, they reached the outskirts of Passchendaele. The bitter fight for what was left of the village took several more days in atrocious conditions.
The buildings had been pounded, and the shell-exploded bodies were so thickly strewn that a fellow couldn't step without stepping on corruption. Our opponents were fighting a rearguard action, which resulted in a massacre for both sides. Our boys were falling like ninepins, but it was even worse for them. If they stood up to surrender, they were mown down by their own machine gun fire aimed from the rear at us. If they leapfrogged back, they were caught in our barrage. Hades was let loose all over again.
By morning, of our team of 6, only my buddy Toombs and I were left. Then came the burst that got Toombs. It got him right in the head. It was a terrible feeling to be the only one left.
A time was set for roll call. There weren't too many of us left to answer our names. If there was no response when a name was called, the sergeant would shout out, "Anybody know anything about him?" Sometimes someone replied. More often, there was silence. My impression was that we had won the ridge and lost the battalion.
The British had lost far more than the battalion. It had taken them more than 3 months to proceed 5 miles at a cost of more than 250,000 casualties, more than half of whom would never be identified or even found. Their adversaries suffered similar casualties, leaving 500,000 men killed or maimed to take or defend 5 miles of mud. And when the Germans decided to retake that mud a few months later, they did so in a few days. The ground that hundreds of thousands of men fought, struggled, and died over for more than 100 days was given up in less than a week. At the entrance of Passchendaele is a monument honoring the men who took what was left of the village. Every year in early November, on the anniversary of the battle for its ruins, we pay tribute to them and to the men they fought. For this had long ceased to be a fight for honor and justice. These men fought one another because they were ordered to do so, and because they had no choice surrounding the monument is the ground they contested. It has long been restored to farming land, but it is resting ground as well for the thousands of men who remain missing. Nearby, at Tyne Cot Cemetery, their names are etched in stone. 35,000 of them. In front of their names, row upon row of graves. 12,000 of them, placed amidst the pillboxes they captured that fall 100 years ago. Their burial grounds meticulously maintained. Most of these men are treated more respectfully in death than they were in life. It is owed to them because this final campaign seemed such a waste. Even the premise that their sacrifice would lead to lasting peace proved a lie, for the war to end all wars was anything but. Just over 20 years later, both sides would be at it again, creating more and even larger burial grounds. So these names and graves and monuments are a lasting reminder that war does not end war. And that is what gives their death meaning. These men died to secure our freedom, not from tyranny, but from insanity. Provided we remember them day after day, in the morning, and at the going down of the sun. Every night when the bell strikes 8, Ypres remembers them. And every time the last post fills the Menine Gate, these names acquire faces. And if you listen very carefully, they speak to us of the horrors they have seen. And they remind us that those who forget are doomed to repeat them, time and time again. If this last post were played just once for every young life lost in the Salient, Ypres will have to stage it every night for the next 1,000 years. If that is what it takes for peace to prevail, they will not have died in vain.